Welcome to What About Design? This is your YouTube channel destined to make you interested in things related to the history of design, principles of design, and other things related to design. Hey, I'm Maria Cernat, your host, and with us today is, as usual, Frank Myung.
I'm glad to be with you again.
Again, so Frank Myung is a graphic designer. He has a lot of experience. We would not mention that because he doesn't like to know, but he doesn't want you to know. But that he worked in this field for quite a while. So we will start today discussing some very interesting things related to the graphic design at the beginning of the century. As usual, I have to mention that I am very much in debt to Jeremy Ainshley, who wrote a wonderful book titled A Century of Graphic Design, where he discusses all these great graphic designers that created over the 20th century and that were very interesting. And he discusses a lot of the things that influenced their creation. Now, we discussed last time how graphic design started and who was the one who coined the term and what were the main directions in graphic design. We are now going to go deeper into this history and focus more on what happened at the beginning of the century. As you all know, of course, the beginning of the 20th century was marked by the First World War that influenced a lot what happened in the industry. And as you remember, I already discussed the fact that basically you need a prosperous society and a stable one in order to have graphic design. But you may think that after the First World War, of course, production suffered greatly. The economy was very much influenced by these tragic events. And you might think that that would have been the end of graphic design, but actually it was not. The First World War proved to be a very interesting place to start graphic design from scratch. And to focus more on creativity and allow a lot of people that aim to be graphic designers before that time but weren't given the opportunity. Okay, now let us move forward to discuss the posters used during World War One. Well, they were recognized basically for their very advanced persuasion techniques. And I have to emphasize here that basically the history of advertising and PR is pretty much embedded into the history of the military and the history of promoting war. I don't know if you knew that, Frank, but they are very much connected. Do you find it, or were you at some point in your career summoned, by the government of some agency to do PR work for the government or the state institutions?
And I mean, I was, yes, actually, a couple of years ago, last year, we did a big campaign, but of course, it was not concerning a war business or, business that was involved with promoting of new technical equipment for war, for example, like bombs or stuff like that. We only made a campaign for Eurofonds of for scientists. So it was completely different thing. But of course, I do agree with you because the most prosperous business right now, even now in the 21st century, is the war business because it is actually considered secret because we don't know how much, for example, arsenal is produced by the countries that are producing that around the world. But it is the most prosperous still in nowadays business in the world?
Well, it began as a business of also selling the war because the First World War was also labeled as the press agents' war because information was very important. For the first time in human history, the most advanced military power was a democracy. So it was very important not to convince only the leaders, but very important, it was to convince the public. Because otherwise, who would have enlisted for the war? Who would have gone to war if they weren't convinced that they absolutely have to do so? In a democracy, you cannot coerce people directly, so you have to develop very clever means of persuasion to do so, to achieve your goals. So basically, what I find interesting is that the number of those posters aimed at young people that were supposed to enlist and go to war actually exceeded the number of commercial posters during the peace period. So the governments were really trying to sell the war to the younger generations, and it was especially difficult for the US President Woodrow Wilson, who came to power promising the American citizens that they would not go to war. So he came with a peaceful agenda, so to speak. He came selling the message of peace, and then he had to sell the message of war. So it is interesting because I talked a little bit last time about the famous poster of Uncle Sam summoning young men to go to the war. Now, this is what happened in Great Britain. Now, they would appeal, and the posters, even though they had ones that resembled the one in USA, they also have this type of emotional blackmail, you know, like this is Great Britain falling prey to the Germans, and you have to enlist and save it, you see. And now this is, also playing the card of telling you that you are not man enough if you don't enlist, if you don't go to war, and you don't go there to save your country. I mean, the children here say to the father, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? I don't know what's the situation right now. I know you that in Poland you have a right-wing government. Is this, they are still trying to sell, this idea of manhood and defending the country, being patriotic and a true man that defends, the national values and so on and so forth?
This is a very complicated question, Maria, because right now we live in a completely different epoch. Because we right now we do have information extremely available. Like in a flash of a second, you can have new, I don't know, new information, new news feed on your iPhone, on your phone in general, like in a split of a second. Back then, if you want to learn something new, you had to read it in a paper or you had to go to a cinema. That was the only way. Or, for example, I mean, at the beginning of the, because they still didn't have radio, they didn't still have television. So the only way to learn something new by this way, but was this way. I mean, like seeing posters on walls or on these special places, cylinders. I don't know how they pylons, and this was the only way. Every information, every news flash is fit to the purpose of the epoch. So probably we don't know what kind of situation, what kind of information would we have right now, but I think we can compare that to the COVID, COVID catastrophe we have right now. It would be repeated over and over 24 times per day, 24 hours per day.
Oh, this type of state propaganda. I completely
Yeah,
agree.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Now,
So so once again, because I think I'm very chaotic in in expressing my thoughts, but I think this was the only way, this was the best way to show the publicity what can you expect from the government, you know, back
But
then.
it is very interesting, that they developed these tools so early. I think that those tools of mass persuasion and using advertising and using PR and very sophisticated techniques use basically helped, especially the USA and also the Western powers, to gain some sort of advantage over other potential enemies. And I think it was pretty useful also during the Cold War because they knew how to appeal to the masses. That is very, very important.
This is nothing new at the beginning, for the beginning of the 20th century, because if I remember correctly, we do have something like brochures, pamphlets, and gazettes. I think from the starting from the from the end of the 18th century. In, for example, in England, the epoch of Romanticism, right? In France, they had this. Some kind of a gazette. It was not exactly a gazette. It was not exactly meant to relay news, but it was used by the state to for the mass publicity to be informed. And the Western countries had a big need for that because they expanded, out of Europe because they have these colonies around the world. So they needed this way of persuasion. They needed this way of informing people, this channels of informing people.
Oh, yes, they did. And of course, it dates back, but I would say that during the First World War, it was also a time of awakening. And while I would agree with you that this was present some time ago, I think it was during the First World War that they were very how should I say that was an awakening moment. They realized
Yeah,
that they have to do it systematically and that they have to
exactly.
invest more and more. And this is basically in 1917, for instance, Woodrow Wilson formed the famous Committee for Public Information that was aimed, at selling the word to the American public. And that proved to be an extremely valuable lesson for the ones that were hired to work there. And amongst them, Edward Bernays, that was going to set up the first PR bureau on Broadway right after the war ended in 1920. So this is very interesting. What you have here is a poster that was used in Great Britain. So you had this type of posters that were appealing and there were some sort of emotional blackmail, and you had this one that was saying, look, we need you, you have to come. So you have here an appeal to, I don't know, trying to shame the public and to emotionally blackmail them, and then to appeal to fear, duty, and other feelings of the sort.
But I would use the word that they did weaponize it. They used it. I mean, they used the public relations as a weapon to gain more people, to gain people, more
Yes,
people
that was the
involved in the war
intention,
business.
right at the beginning. You are perfectly right to emphasize that was the intention right from the beginning. It was not an intention to inform, but it was an intention to persuade, actually, and not to debate, but to persuade. And that tells a lot about the pattern, the model that served the American further PR professionals, and how this model was used and not another one. Now I will go briefly right now on and discuss what happened on various parts of the world. Now, a very, very interesting personality, a very interesting period. At the beginning of the century, Italy was struggling. Italy just gained it was a huge movement for forming the national state. They were pretty polarized, poor, and a lot of the parts of Italy were still feudal and at the beginning, so to speak, at the civilizational process. And basically, they were organized, and the society was extremely polarized. And here comes, there were basically two forces, as always: the ones who are leftist and the ones who are right wingers. And the leftists were gathered basically around the personality of Antonio Gramsci, who was unfortunately put in prison and who wrote from there the most impressive philosophical work, one of the most impressive philosophical works of the 20th century. But unfortunately, it was Benito Mussolini who gained the power in 1922, and he stayed in power for quite a while till 1943. So for these 2 decades, he was basically the ruler. He was a fascist. But you know what is interesting right now? It is that Filippo Marinetti, who might seem like just some designer, just some poet, was actually a big fan of Mussolini. He supported him, and not only did he supported him, but in 1909 he published the Futurist Manifesto, and then exactly 10 years later, he co-authored the Fascist Manifesto. Now, I was very curious to look at the Fascist Manifesto. If anyone has the curiosity, even though it is a little bit beyond the interest of this course, but I cannot help myself but tell you that it is a very interesting document that you might find summarized online. And some of the regulations and ideas proposed, you know what they were? Let me tell you just a few. Vote for everyone. Vote for women. Lowering the retirement age from 65 to 55. You know? And it is very interesting that in terms of economy and also of democracy, what they came up with was rather tempting. And you have to read it because it's fascinating if you look at it. And had you not known that it is the Fascist Manifesto, some of the things written there seem very, very democratic, inclusive, and revolutionary. Now, of course, the things that are very controversial are related to, keeping the nation safe and protecting the nation and having a pure race and all the things related in general with the fascist ideology. But when you look at this type of measurements that I just mentioned, you might find yourself very puzzled, and I found myself very puzzled. Now, what did he say in terms of art? Because this is also interesting. He was basically why do we call this movement the Italian futurism? Because it is based on the future, basically. But what about the future and what elements related to the future? Well, he said something like this. This is a quote, actually. The sound of the engine of a car that seems to be running with bullets is more beautiful than Victoria of Samothrace. This is a Greek sculpture depicting the goddess Victory of Night, dating from 190 BC, and it was found in the island of Samothrace. He said that he would trade, without hesitation, this car, because I found an image of a car that dates back then, to this sculpture. And you know why I'm discussing this? Because we found nowadays people that are so appalled by what is happening in art, and they say, "Oh, but they chose like a person of color to play Jesus," or they played, at the Berlin Opera, Aida, the famous opera from Giuseppe Verdi, by having all the decorum settled in a way that suggested that the colonists stole the artifacts, and they are so appalled, and especially in Romania. We have a theater director that said that at one audition, not rehearsal, they were auditioning for Giulietta from Romeo and Juliet, and a transgender boy came, and they said, well, you should not play Giulietta. And this is so hypocrite, because for a long time, women were not allowed on stage, basically only boys. But right now, we cannot have that, just to see how things change.
About the Greek sculpture depicting the Greek goddess Nike, a victory found in Samothraki. This exactly figure is on the front mask of the Rolls Royce. You can check that. I mean, it's a very similar one. It is also called Nike. So actually, it was put in use.
Well, it was put in use. It was used as a brand, but he didn't want. He would have probably agreed to do that, but what he didn't agree with, I will just move forward with what he said here, also in his Futurist Manifesto. We want to fight vigorously against the fanatical, snobbish, and unconscious religious worship of the past, which is fueled by the harmful influence of museums. We revolt against the unreserved admiration of old paintings, statues, and objects, and all that is eaten by worms and time. We consider that contempt for everything that is young, new, and exciting for life is unfair and criminal. So basically, what I'm trying to say here, I don't know if you agree, is that these people find it so hard to understand that sometimes in art, you encounter this type of revolutionary movements that want to change everything, want to change and want something new. And you should not be afraid or think that this is the end of the world, because he wrote this quite some time ago. So this is a declaration from 1905. Okay. The way the books were designed. I have here an image with old books. Why do I show this? Because if you remember, William Morris was a British designer that wanted to have everything, painting manually and have books on a certain type of paper and have everything nicely and cleverly crafted in order to produce a masterpiece out of a book, And he was very much appalled actually by that, and he wanted to change everything. He said something like, I initiate a typographic revolution against the book of the past, against the handmade paper accompanied by images of helmets, Minerva, the god Apollo, red initials, vegetables, and framing with mythological frames and figures, epigraphs, and Roman numerals. The book must be a futuristic expression of futuristic thinking. Not only that, my revolution is directed against the so-called harmony of the page. So he says that in another manifesto, The Destruction of Syntax, that he wants to change everything, basically. And he did.
The world needed this modernity because the epoch was appealing to these people, because they had steam. Actually, the steam locomotives were much earlier. But, in these years, at the beginning of the 20th century, metro starts to appeal in Paris and London. So, the technological improvement went far ahead. Like also the first cars were invented, also the first planes were invented, Actually, I don't know if you know that the first plane was used in the Balkan Wars for first
I
times.
didn't know that.
Yeah, and this revolution, this type of people were needed for the epoch, or in other words, the epoch was, the egg from that, these people came. So you need, like every every plant needs soil to grow. So the same thing happened to the artists, to the conceptionists from that period of time.
Well, yes, and I find it very interesting. And it was not the end of the world. You see that it was such a revolution that he wanted, and it was not the end of the world. And I always say, look, when you talk about art, you have to be prepared for change, for major changes, for things to be completely different. Okay.
If you make change, if you are something else, then you will be recognizable because your style will be unique, and also the memory of you will last as an artist. So I think
Yes, this is also
this was
very
the
important.
urge. This is the drug of the artist to be, remembered for a long time.
This is what happened in Italy, and it's so peculiar that it was related to such controversial political, personality like Mussolini.
Yeah.
But it is also interesting to see how he developed his new ideas and how he was able to, deal away with the past. And deal away with an art, this is also very important to know, deal away with an art that was designed for the elites and not for the public. This is the major shift that took place at the beginning of the century. And basically, all that happened in Italy, what happened, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and in other places, and in Bauhaus in Germany, in the Republic of Weimar, also expresses this major shift in design when you don't have art in general and design in particular as a tool, as a means to entertain the elites, but you have art and designers addressing the public and wanting to bring the public closer to art, design, and their creations. Now, what is interesting here, what happened in Italy, we move now to a very interesting place like Switzerland, where you have Dadaism. Also, the Romanian students know about this movement because we had along Hugo Ball that basically founded, along others, this movement. We have a Romanian, Tristan Tzara, and usually he's mentioned during the 12th grade when they are studying literature. And it's a shame that they are only mentioning him and not going deeper into this very interesting poetic personality that was Tristan Tzara. Because here, what happened, when we talk about all these currents, it seems, or these movements in design and history of design, it seems like they were these very serious individuals that were carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they were also, very well read and serious all the time. While in fact, this movement was nothing but serious, I would say, in the way it formed. I mean, it was a bunch of friends basically meeting up in what they later called Cabaret Voltaire. That was basically a back room in a tavern in Zurich. And while gathering there, because Switzerland was independent and it was neutral during the First World War, and a lot of people fled the war and gathered there, and they started meeting. And when they met, they showed their paintings or They played music, or they wanted to see what other things about their lyrics and the poetry they wrote. And this is how the movement basically started, as some sort of gathering among friends. It was not like all these men came together and thought, oh, we must start an artistic movement right now, because a century later we will end up in a course of history of design. This is what we have to do. It was nothing of the sort. And I find this to be very interesting, a very interesting artistic experiment. And basically, I also like the whole idea that guided these people. And it is somehow summarized here. Hugo Boss said it. It is necessary to clarify the intentions of this cabaret. Its goal is to remind the world that there are people with independent minds beyond war and nationalism who live for different ideals. Among the founders of that, as I told you, was also Samuel Rosenstock, also known as Tristan Tzara. This was his literary pseudonym. And other important figures and personalities were related to this movement that proved to be a very interesting artistic experiment. So basically, we had in Italy a situation where you had a very important designer, poet, and artist that was related to the fascists, while here you had people that said no to war, nationalism, and all sorts of authoritarianism and politics.
Well, I think it's still like that in today's day, in previous day.
Yes, you anticipated
Because
my
there
point.
are artists who are, connected to the far left. There are artists who are connected to the far right. So this division is still, and there are of course artists who don't care and who wants to change the world completely. But maybe later on your design course, we will say more about that.
Yes, well, how would you find yourself? Are you more of a pacifist and neutral, or would you like to go, and do you feel connected to some sort of
I
ideological
think
perspective?
I'm a futurist, but not in a style of this. But not in the style of Marinetti. We now possess completely new. Uh, if you ask me personally, I think I would say that right now, on the top of the fashion in the 21st century is the interdisciplinary workout, the interdisciplinary research. So I think this is the most important thing. And I think we can, talk about that later.
Okay, so what happened in Russia? You know, the Cold War rhetoric, as I always tell my students, made us believe that everything that happened in Russia was bad, and everything that happened in the western part of the world was good. And we only emphasize, due to the horrible things happening in Gulag and due to the extremely well popularized books by Solzhenitsyn and others, we only think about the horrors of that system, while actually what happened in Russia at the beginning of the century was very interesting from an artistic point of view, for different and many reasons, and I will go through it. Well, first of all, as I told you, there was this major shift in the way designers thought about themselves, their creation, and the public. They thought, and this is how the modernist movement was created, that they could build a universal language that could appeal to the masses. And why fonts, sans serif, and geometric shapes that would be able to constitute this vocabulary of universal visual communication? Why? Because a lot of the people were illiterate. So they search, the basic elements, and they searched this type of visual language that could appeal to the masses, that could be appealing and attractive, even though for those who are illiterate. And it is also very interesting that it is a universal language that was supposed to go beyond national and cultural barriers. Also a very interesting objective for designers at that time and for artists. Institutionally, in the buildings belonging to the School of Art in Moscow, they set up this VTEMAS, which is the acronym of a very, very long name in Russian that I cannot pronounce. Higher Technical Artistic Studios. But this is also a shortening version of the long one in Russian. And as I said, not everything is in black and white. What happened there was extraordinary for many reasons. First of all, the people gathered there, like Elisisky, Alexander Rodchenko, like Vladimir Tatlin and others. They gathered there, and they wanted to start teaching art based on a different set of principles. First of all, they wanted to be inclusive, and they wanted to make people coming from rural areas and from workers coming and starting to learn and to become designers. They wanted to be inclusive, and they had some sort of course that was taught for those who had no secondary education, in order to prepare them for this school of design. Second of all, and very important, and this is emphasized by this researcher, Christina Lodler, who has a very interesting presentation on exactly this type of movement, VTEMAS. And she says that basically they were quite chaotic at the beginning and anarchists, because there are a lot of people teaching there, and the students would move from one teacher to another, and it soon proved to be too chaotic, and they tried to give it more structure. But what is also interesting is not only the fact that they wanted people to come there from different, cultural, social, and economic backgrounds, but they also wanted to change the teaching method. I mean, before that, you would have gone to school, and for 4 years, you would have painted like, I don't know, the great masters, and you would have mimicked their art, and you would have tried to do paintings that would mimic, or artwork that would mimic the great masters. And after 4 years, as Christina Lodler says, you would have been granted the chance to put paint on a canvas. Can you imagine? And they said, no, this is not the way to go. And of course, everybody had a different teaching method. And this is why it was such a creative, artistic and social experiment. And they were not only aiming to form, like designers, but also teachers of design and professors of design. So it was basically a specialized educational institution to provide advanced artistic and technical training, creating to prepare highly qualified artists for the industry, also instructors and specialists in the vocational and technical education. And at the beginning, they were teaching also sculpture, also painting. As I told you, it was quite anarchist, and a lot of enthusiasm was fueled into this movement by very idealistic young artists, like this one, who is considered to be and usually labeled as the father of Russian constructivism, That is Vladimir Tatlin that says, we will place our works in the square and on the streets, convinced that art must not remain a lifeless sanctuary. See here the resemblance with Marinetti, who also wanted a very vivid art. A consolation for the bored and a justification for the lazy. Art must follow us in all those places where life manifests itself. So what we can see here is a major shift in terms of the relation of artist to its art, the public, the role of art in society, and everything connected to that. I mean, art was no longer supposed to be something extremely refined, destined for the elites, but something very inclusive, something very open for the public and very appealing to the public. And I would say that that lasted until today. Don't you agree?
I think their idea was that, I mean, in today art schools, students are taught this way, that you first learn the techniques, right? This what is learned before you, and how can you operate the techniques, the forms of art and stuff. Then first you are learning the so-called theory, and with a little bit of a practice, right? But your freedom is not limited, you know, today. I mean, your freedom is unlimited. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you like with these forms. But in socialist Russia, actually, you will go to the machine part then later. In Polish films and in Czech films and in films from the beginning of that of the socialist era, actually, a crunch from a combine or a crunch from a tractor became art because it looked something else, and it was also shown on squares or on markets as an art. And actually, this is a whole style which lasted through the generations of the socialist realism, and it lasted until today. But today, what we have for masses is already ready to use forms of art. It's not like it's not original art. Very rare people are doing something original from the scratch. Because, for example, musicians are using samples. You know, we in the apps we are using in our smartphones, we are using ready to use, artistic expressions. For example, effects or stuff on schablons. Everything is ready to use. This is nothing that is, produced from the ground zero.
Basically, there were three important movements that created that bigger movement that we call nowadays modernism. It was a Dutch magazine. Can you say it for me, because you seem to be knowledgeable?
Yeah, the style.
Okay, so the Bauhaus School of Design in Germany, and also this Wuchtemaß that I talked recently. I talked just earlier, that took place in Moscow. Now, I also discussed in the first part the most important designers like El Lissitzky. He was had a prodigious artistic activity, and he strongly influenced contemporary art. I showed here just a few of his creations, and he basically was working with the major artists from Russia, like Vladimir Mayakovsky and others. What we have here, one of the most famous of his designs, because he was very much preoccupied with finding what I said, this common language, this very appealing language that would not be sophisticated so that people could understand it easily, that a language that would relate to the masses. And in this, I would find this perspective to be a little bit naive, because I don't know how much people would understand from an artwork like this. But actually what he meant is what that the red triangle is the Red Army defeating the White Army in the Bolshevik Revolution. So I don't think that, population that was not at all educated and had no basic, knowledge, also in art, would have been able to decipher this artistic message. But
I had also difficulties understanding this. I understood it until you said what it is about, and I do speak Russian, and I understand what is written there. So
yeah, well, another important designer, a set of designers actually, Alexandra Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova. I discussed a little bit his works when I talked also in the principles of design and how important it is to have diagonals and the role of the lines and the role of the perspective. And of course, I think all that comes in time. I mean, I really love this, domain of design, because you have to look at picture to create some sort of, visual culture, if I may say so, to get yourself informed. I also like Varvara Stepanova because she was the one that said, look, fashion should be for everybody. Fashion should be inclusive. Fashion should be something that most Russian women could wear on their way to work, on a working day. They should not be something that would transform a woman into some sort of decoration, into an object, and that would prevent her from expressing herself as a mother, as a worker, and as a professional. And she designed actually for Russian women clothing. This is what she was famous for. And this is so interesting to see how revolutionary that was, because we think, oh, but the clothing was so dull and so boring. Well, do you prefer the garments, because we have all these movies from the 19th century or from the medieval century, and everybody's focusing on the dresses, but nobody's thinking, look, you could not wear something like that and still work, because it would be impossible. If you want to transform yourself into this doll, porcelain doll that does nothing, you would also have to live in a castle and hire a bunch of servants to help you put on and get off that thing.
it was the corset problem because at that time, the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 20th, young women get rid of the corsets. So they started. They felt lighter. Then they changed the way of they were dressing because they didn't need anymore these huge dresses that they had to put on layers of them. Like wedding cake layers. And
Yes.
they throw this away. They throw away the big hair they had that you have to prepare every day. And in the 20s, you can see all over the world, the thin figure of the women with lighter dresses, with shorter hair, or very similar to what you wear right now. This until
This
the,
medium
the
hair.
the line of the jaw. Yeah, exactly. And also the style of the dances changed because this was the era of the foxtrot, of the light moves, the light steps. So it was a revolution then. After the World War I.
What is also interesting is that Rodchenko also worked with the most important artists of the day. I just gave here, and he drew famous posters for famous works, and he was well known. And I gave just one example here. So this was a poster that he created for the 1925 movie, a very um,
Iconic.
famous movie directed by Sergei Eisenstein, and he made the poster for it. I don't know what it says here.
Bronenosis Potemkin. That is the name of the
The
ship.
cruiser. Now we come to what happened in Germany. What happened in Italy. We saw what happened in Russia. We saw what happened in Switzerland. Now let us see what happened in Germany, because this is also very important. And I often tell my students that even the block of flats that we looked at that were very functional and very, built with this idea of being functional and efficient were influenced actually by this particular artistic and architectural movement, the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is closely related also to a political moment in the history of Germany. We call the Republic of Weimar what happened between 1919 in Germany, when Friedrich Ebert came to power, until 1933 when Hitler came to power. So that was basically the short-lived Republic of Weimar. And this Weimar Republic also was the host for this Bauhaus movement that was opened under the auspices of Walter Gropius in 1919 and was closed. It moved a lot, and basically in 1933, when Hitler came to power, they had to close down. And the idea is that one of the most important professors and teachers that taught there was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and he was the one that had to fled along the others. And they were basically obsessed with these ideas of simplicity and functionality, from architecture to consumer goods. The principle of simplicity and functionalism had to prevail. And what is interesting is that he was one of the first to take painting to persuasion communication, because he had to flee, and he fled to the United States. He campaigned, like others, for this demographic and mass accessible graphic vocabulary. He was interested in the possibilities of combining printing text and photography. He was so attached to the idea of design, and he said that the literate of the future will be the ones who will not know to use a camera. So what we see here is some principles. I know enthusiasm towards technology, the idea of transforming art from an element that would entertain the elites to something that is designed for the masses and would appeal to the masses, building a common vocabulary and building a common language and ground so that people could relate to the work art.
Maybe I should say only one thing, that I would draw a line between the Protestantism, like a religious movement, through the Bauhaus, and now to the minimalism, because this is an evolution of a thought, of an artistic thought. Minimalism, simplicity and Protestantism, the functionality. Because in the Protestant philosophy, in the Protestant philosophy, they are extremely. The functionality is the most important thing. Like where we have Protestantism in Sweden, in Germany, Western Germany, in Northern Germany, in Holland, in in England also. So almost right now, the minimalism, like a movement, like a style, is very popular there, like as a contemporary form of the Bauhaus.
I think it's a very clever, intuition to relate it to this, also to this change, in terms of thinking about art, about artists, about principles that have to guide, also the artistic movement. Now in France, we had one important designer that I also discussed in my course of introduction to advertising, that is Cassandra. His name was Adolphe Jean-Marie Moreau, and he was famous, a famous painter, but he took this pseudonym because he wanted to create a different identity. He was born in Ukraine. He was trained in the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris, and he was the one that created these very nice, posters uh, that basically were able to transform unknown brands to major hits. This is only one of his very famous posters. What do you think about it?
It looks very, very. I was even surprised at the first glance. It looks extremely temporary, like it was created yesterday.
Really?
Yeah, because of the forms, because of the font. This is actually Bauhaus, exactly. Very similar. I mean, yeah, this is Bauhaus. Actually, the living blocks, the socialist blocks that we see all over Eastern Europe, are also from the Bauhaus school. The
Yes,
meaning.
I said that I tell my
Oh, you
students,
didn't
well,
hear it. Okay,
if you
sorry.
look at your block of flats, you must
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that they
yeah,
were influenced
yeah,
by
yeah, yeah.
that
I
movement.
understood. I understood that you said the block of light, because of the connection. So that's where my mind didn't switch on to. Yeah, but it looks very, very contemporary.
It looks contemporary, isn't it? So he was able, because a very important institution that was fundamental to the development and amplifying modernist messages and hosting in their hosting important exhibitions was the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this was an important institution in promoting this type of promoting designers that came from this movement. Now, also not so glamorous but very important is also the avant-garde movement. Can you say it again?
The style, the style,
The style.
the style.
It was an important movement in modern design centered around the magazine of the same name. And it was founded in 1917, and he ran it from 1917 until his death. Theo van Doisburg, I think it's his
Yeah.
name. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. They also worked on these principles of elementarism and functionalism. And many members of the movement work for Dutch companies, help them to create their visual identities. Now we are approaching the end of our discussion, but we could not approach the end of our presentation without discussing what happened in the United States. Now, in the United States, it is interesting that Art Deco was very much the word of the day,
Leading.
and they liked it so much because it I would have to say that what is very important in the United States is that there were no political ideals, basically. They just wanted to sell consumer goods and design buildings, and that was the place where basically design was related to the commercial domain and not to the political one. The most popular expression of modernism was this Art Deco. It was named after the abbreviation of the International Exhibition of Modern, Decorative, and Industrial Arts in Paris. And it takes elements of futurism or cubism, but without clear political commitments, without criticism of the art of the past. Just do it. And I put here the Chrysler building that was built at the beginning of the century, that was in the competition with the Empire State Building. Finally, you know who won?
Of course, the Empire State Building won
Empire State
because
Building.
because of the radio antenna, right? Am I right?
And not only the radio antenna, but I think that was part of the reason that they they won the competition. And this one I would think is very beautiful. And in terms of aesthetics, I think this one is clearly superior.
Of course.
And
In my own humble opinion, the Art Deco is the most beautiful of the modern styles because it looks extremely harmonic. Because also it is used all over. You can see it all over. The pattern of the Art Deco, you can see it everywhere. Starting even, you can even see the resemble in proportions in Star Wars, because it's built on three squares, one of the top, not not the golden section, but it's three squares. So it is everything is huge and thin, and it looks like a statuesque. That's for it's very elegant, and also it incorporates this geometrical decorations, which are beautiful. I like it. This is my one of my favorite styles. Art Deco.
really,
Yeah.
well, I'm happy you share that with us. I want to say that what interests me here is that basically in the United States, they wanted to they used basically all these artistic currents, and they basically severed the link between the artistic way of expression and their political ideals, and they used it for a completely different purpose. I told you that the Museum of Modern Art in New York promoted a lot European modernism through organized exhibitions. Many designers also started to work for very popular magazines such as Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, or Fortune. And the ideological assumption of modernism as a movement determined to change society, and the role of art became rapid adoption of the American continent. But this was dominated here by the commercial spirit. As Jeremy Ashley said, it was a set of mimetically copied mannerisms. Basically, they wanted to take the elements that were specific for modernism and put it to work to sell consumer goods. Its dominant feature, the trend of simplification, the use of signs and symbols, will be transformed in the United States into a visual language that artistically serves corporation. So it will be also a path for individual experimentation. I would now have to go back to the Fuchtermasse and say that basically they reorganized this very chaotic and very free artistic experiment, because they said, look, you are not here for yourselves as artists, you are here for the society, and you have to help build the social consciousness of the masses. You are not here like children who are playing with art, but you have a higher purpose to serve. And in the United States, from a social project, modernism, as Jeremy Ashley says, was transformed into a commercial and individual project. And this is basically what happened at the beginning of the century. A lot of things were related to the political ideals. Some of them were in opposition to what was happening, but still related, even though they were opposing, they were still relating to that. So they were pretty much influenced by the political events. Except, of course, what happened in the United States, because they found this way of taking art and using it. So basically, you see that capitalism is the one system that basically dominated art. The other ones, it is very interesting how they used art for political reasons, and it is here that already the economic domination was present, and the art was used to sell, not to tell people something. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you very much, Frank, for being here with us today again. And I hope to see you all next time. Okay, and subscribe to our channel and like and share it if you liked it.